June 7th, 1942. The tiny island of Attu, perched at the western edge of Alaska's Aleutian chain, witnessed something that hadn't happened on American soil since 1812. Japanese soldiers of the 301st Independent Infantry Battalion stepped onto the beach, planted their flag, and claimed United States territory. 42 Inuit villagers, descendants of people who had lived on these islands for 10,000 years, watched as their world changed forever. They would soon be prisoners, shipped to Japan, where 16 of them would perish in internment camps. But this invasion, this first occupation of American soil by a foreign power in over a century, triggered something unexpected. It awakened a force the Japanese military planners had never anticipated. Across the vast wilderness of Alaska, from the frozen shores of the Arctic Ocean to the fog-shrouded Aleutian Islands, over 6,000 indigenous people were about to become America's most effective defenders in the North. Their story has been largely forgotten, overshadowed by the massive battles in the Pacific and Europe. Yet these men and women, many of them Inuit, Aleut and Yupik peoples, formed the eyes and ears of the United States military along 6,600 miles of Alaskan coastline. They hunted Japanese submarines with the same skills they used to hunt seals. They tracked enemy movements across terrain that would have destroyed conventional military units, and they did it all while being denied basic civil rights in their own land. This is the story of the Alaska Territorial Guard, the elite Carstens cutthroats, and the indigenous warriors who defended America when it needed them most. The threat was real, and it was terrifying. On June 3, 1942, Japanese carrier-based aircraft struck Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island, targeting the small American naval facility there. The attack wasn't just a raid, it was the opening move in Japan's campaign to control the Aleutian Islands, the stepping stones between Asia and North America. Japanese military planners believed these islands could prevent American and Soviet forces from coordinating attacks through the northern Pacific. They saw Alaska as a dagger pointed at Japan's heart, and they intended to break that blade. 2 days after the Dutch Harbor attack, Japanese forces landed on Kiska Island, capturing a Navy weather station crew. The following day, over 1,100 Japanese soldiers came ashore at Attu, the westernmost point of Alaska. The occupation was swift and brutal. Charles Foster Jones, a 63-year-old radio operator, managed to send one desperate message to Dutch Harbor before destroying his equipment. When Japanese soldiers demanded he repair it, he refused. They executed him the next day, making him the only American civilian put to death by enemy forces in North America during the entire war. The psychological impact rippled across Alaska and the American West Coast. If the Japanese could take Attu and Kiska, what would stop them from establishing air bases within striking distance of Seattle, San Francisco, or even the vital Lend-Lease route through which America supplied aircraft to the Soviet Union? Military strategists remembered what General Billy Mitchell had told Congress in 1935. "I believe that in the future, whoever holds Alaska will hold the world." But there was a massive problem. Alaska was virtually defenseless. In August 1941, just 4 months before Pearl Harbor, the US Army had made a catastrophic decision. They reassigned all Alaska National Guard units to Washington state, leaving the territory with almost no organized military presence. When the Japanese invaded, Alaska had roughly 45,000 military personnel total, but most were concentrated at a few bases. The territory's 6,600 miles of coastline, its countless islands, its vast interior, these areas were essentially unguarded. Into this crisis stepped an unlikely figure. Major Marvin Muktuk Marston, serving as a military aide to Alaska's territorial governor, Ernest Gruening, had an idea that military brass initially dismissed as desperate or crazy. He proposed recruiting Alaska's indigenous peoples to form a home guard. These weren't soldiers in any conventional sense. Many had never seen formal military training. But Marston understood something the military establishment didn't. These people knew the land intimately. They could survive in conditions that would destroy regular army units. They were expert marksmen, trained from childhood to bring down game with a single shot because ammunition was precious. They could read weather patterns, navigate by stars and landmarks, and operate in terrain where maps were useless. In June 1942, as Japanese forces consolidated their hold on Attu and Kiska, Governor Gruening authorized the creation of the Alaska Territorial Guard. Marston set out on one of the most remarkable recruitment drives in American military history. He travelled across Alaska by whatever means available, often by dog sled in winter, covering 680 miles on one journey alone. He visited villages that had never seen a recruiting officer, places so remote that mail arrived once a month if they were lucky. And everywhere he went, people volunteered. They volunteered despite having every reason to distrust the American government. They volunteered knowing they wouldn't be paid, that they'd have to supply much of their own equipment. They volunteered because this was their home, and someone had to defend it. By the time recruitment concluded, the Alaska Territorial Guard comprised over 6,300 volunteers from 107 communities across the territory. The demographics of this force would have amazed military planners accustomed to rigid age and gender requirements. Men as old as 80 enlisted, their decades of wilderness experience too valuable to ignore. Boys as young as 12 joined, and over 27 women became official members of the ATG. The force brought together Aleut, Athabaskan, Inupiaq, Haida, Tlingit, Tsimshian, and Yupik peoples, along with some non-Indigenous Alaskans. For the first time, these diverse groups were united in a common military effort. The volunteers came from every background. Subsistence hunters who could track animals across miles of trackless snow, fishermen who knew every current and tide along Alaska's coasts, trappers who could survive for weeks in the wilderness with minimal supplies, reindeer herders from the North Slope, elders who carried traditional knowledge passed down through generations, and teenagers eager to prove themselves in defense of their homeland. The mission of the Alaska Territorial Guard was elegantly simple and brutally difficult. They were to be the eyes and ears of the American military across Alaska's vast expanse. Their primary objective was safeguarding the area around Platinum, a village housing the only platinum mine in the Western Hemisphere, a strategic resource critical to the war effort. Second, they secured the terrain beneath the Lend-Lease air route, the vital corridor through which American aircraft flew from Great Falls, Montana through Canada to Fairbanks, then on to Nome before crossing to the Soviet Union. Thousands of warplanes travelled this route, and the ATG ensured Japanese forces couldn't establish observation posts or attack stations along it. Third, they created and maintained survival caches along transportation corridors and coastal regions. These supply dumps could mean the difference between life and death for downed pilots or shipwrecked sailors. But beyond these official missions, the ATG performed countless other tasks. They watched the skies for enemy aircraft, learning to identify Japanese planes by silhouette and engine sound. They monitored the seas for submarines and surface vessels. They built fake fortifications using barrels and logs to create decoys that resembled artillery pieces when viewed from Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. Every night they enforced blackout procedures across their villages, covering windows so no light could guide enemy bombers. They created communications networks using Morse code and radio, reporting anything suspicious to military command. And they did it all while maintaining their subsistence lifestyles, hunting, fishing and trapping to feed their families because there was no military salary, no government ration cards for most of them. Training was practical and intense. The volunteers were issued World War I era Enfield rifles, uniforms, snowshoes and basic equipment. They learned military drill and organisation, though their units operated with far more flexibility than regular army forces. They studied how to identify enemy ships and aircraft using recognition guides. They practiced communications protocols and learned to operate field radios. But mostly, they applied skills they already possessed to military purposes. A lifetime of tracking caribou translated directly to tracking human movement across snow. The ability to navigate in whiteout conditions became tactical mobility when conventional units were grounded. The patience required to wait hours for a seal to surface at a breathing hole became the patience needed for surveillance and reconnaissance. As one ATG member later recalled, the instructors told them, "Follow your training and it will save your life." But the real training, the knowledge that made them effective, came from their cultures and their ancestors. Retired Sergeant First Class Sam Jackson, who joined as a teenager and was still alive in 2017 at age 93, remembered those days vividly. "They called us the ears for the army and eyes for the army," he said. He recalled helping maintain blackouts, ensuring no light escaped from buildings that could guide Japanese bombers. He remembered the constant vigilance, the knowledge that at any moment enemy forces might appear on the horizon. Stanley Rogers, who served in Vietnam and whose family included approximately 70 ATG members, heard stories throughout his life about what the volunteers witnessed. Japanese ships off the Bering Sea coast, possible spies coming ashore, suspicious activity that was immediately reported to military authorities. Everyone was a sentry, Rogers explained. Whatever they saw that was not appropriate, they would report it. He was certain that if the Japanese had attempted a full-scale invasion of Alaska's interior, they would have faced devastating resistance. They would have never made it, he stated with confidence. The ATG would have beaten them back. The terrain itself would have been a weapon. Regular military units struggled to operate in Alaska's brutal environment, but for the ATG, this was home. They knew where to find shelter, how to read the weather, which routes were passable in different seasons. They could survive on the land when supply lines failed. They understood that in Alaska, nature was often more dangerous than any human enemy. But while the Alaska Territorial Guard watched the coastlines and interior, another unit took the fight directly to the enemy. The 1st Alaskan Combat Intelligence Platoon, better known as Kastner's Cutthroats, represented the elite edge of Alaska's indigenous military contribution. Formed in November 1941, just weeks before Pearl Harbor, this unit of 66 men was the brainchild of Colonel Lawrence Kastner, intelligence chief of the Alaska Defense Command. Kastner, bearing a jagged scar down his chin from his days as a masterful swordsman, handpicked every member of his unit. He wanted men who could flourish in conditions that would destroy regular soldiers. He found them among Alaska's indigenous peoples, particularly Aleuts and Eskimos, alongside sourdough prospectors, hunters, trappers, and fishermen. These weren't conventional soldiers. They wore a hodgepodge of military and civilian gear. They carried whatever weapons they preferred, often hunting rifles and personal sidearms rather than standard military issue. They operated with minimal oversight, given tremendous latitude to accomplish their missions however they saw fit. They had nicknames like Bad Whiskey Red, Aleut Pete, and Water Bucket Ben. The military press dubbed them Kastner's Cutthroats, though the men themselves preferred the simpler designation, Alaska Scouts. Their specialty was reconnaissance in impossible conditions. Operating in isolated groups of 10 or fewer, they lived off the land and used stealth to avoid detection. Their missions required them to observe enemy positions without being discovered and report back intelligence that commanders would use for strategic decisions. When the Japanese occupied Attu and Kiska, elements of the Alaska Scouts were among the first forces inserted onto surrounding islands to monitor enemy activity. They witnessed the brutal conditions of the Aleutian climate firsthand. This wasn't tropical island warfare. This was survival in an environment where hurricane-force winds called williwaws could appear without warning, where fog was so thick you couldn't see 10 feet, where temperatures and constant rain made simple existence a challenge. Yet the Alaska Scouts thrived. On August 28, 1942, 2 US submarines surfaced 4 miles off Adak Island and disembarked 37 Alaska Scouts. Their mission was to determine if Japanese forces occupied the island and to identify suitable locations for an American airbase. They found the island unoccupied, and more importantly, they discovered a solution to a critical problem. The mountainous terrain offered no suitable locations for an airfield, but the Scouts identified a lagoon. American engineers would later dam and drain it, using the sandy bottom as a temporary landing strip that eventually became a major airbase. This base at Adak would prove crucial in the campaign to retake Attu and Kiska, shortening the distance between American air bases and Japanese positions. When Operation Landcrab launched on May 11, 1943 to retake Attu, the Alaska Scouts played an essential role. Over 15,000 American troops, primarily from the 7th Infantry Division, landed on the frozen island to face approximately 2,400 Japanese defenders. What followed was 18 days of some of the most brutal combat in the Pacific War. The Battle of Attu killed 549 Americans, wounded over 1,100, and evacuated another 2,100 for weather-related injuries like frostbite, exposure, and trench foot. The environment was as deadly as the enemy. Men fought in conditions that exceeded anything military planners had prepared them for. Many soldiers had been training in California and were issued uniforms inadequate for Alaskan weather. Their boots fell apart in the constant wet and cold. They suffered from hypothermia even while fighting. The Alaska Scouts, however, knew how to survive. They served as guides for regular army units, leading them through terrain that would have been impassable otherwise. They provided intelligence on Japanese positions. They operated as messengers when radio communications failed, and they witnessed some of the war's most horrifying moments. Sergeant George Gray, watching from Cold Mountain, saw through binoculars as Japanese soldiers, facing inevitable defeat, detonated hand grenades against their own bodies rather than surrender. The battle culminated in a massive banzai charge on May 29th, when the remaining Japanese forces launched a desperate final assault. When it ended, only 29 Japanese soldiers survived as prisoners out of a force of roughly 2,600. The Alaska Scouts had proved their worth in the deadliest conditions imaginable, but even as the conventional military threat from Japan diminished after the recapture of Attu and Kiska, Alaska faced a new and bizarre danger. In November 1944, the Japanese military launched the first intercontinental weapons in human history. They were called Fugo, or fire balloons, hydrogen-filled paper balloons 33 feet in diameter, carrying incendiary devices and anti-personnel bombs. The Japanese launched approximately 9,000 of these weapons, sending them into the jet stream to cross the Pacific Ocean. The plan was diabolic in its simplicity. The balloons would drift for days across the ocean, then release their bombs to start massive forest fires across the American West, spreading panic and diverting resources from the war effort. Between November 1944 and April 1945, over 300 of these balloons reached North America. They were spotted from Holy Cross, Alaska to Nogales, Arizona, and as far east as Grand Rapids, Michigan. Most fell harmlessly or failed to detonate, but they represented a real threat, and someone needed to watch for them. The Alaska Territorial Guard, already trained to identify enemy aircraft and report suspicious activity, took on this new mission. A TG members spotted the distinctive white orbs floating in the skies above Alaska. They tracked them, reported their positions, and in some cases helped to shoot them down or safely demolish them after landing. Major Marston, founder of the ATG, later stated in a 1961 interview that his forces were among the first to warn American authorities about the balloon bombs in mid-December 1944. Their greatest fear was that the Japanese would use the balloons for biological warfare, releasing disease agents over populated areas or livestock regions. Fortunately, this never occurred. The 11th Air Force shot down multiple balloons over the Aleutian Islands, including 9 in a single day over Attu on April 11, 1945. The ATG's vigilance contributed to keeping casualties from these weapons minimal. Only 6 Americans died from Japanese balloon bombs during the entire war, in a tragic incident when a Sunday school teacher and 5 children discovered one in Oregon and accidentally detonated it. The Japanese, receiving no reports of their balloon's effectiveness due to American media censorship, cancelled the program in April 1945, deeming it a failure. They never knew how close their weapons had come to American population centres or how effective the indigenous guardians of Alaska had been in neutralising them. The Alaska Territorial Guard operated until 1947, when it was disbanded. In those 5 years, these volunteers had accomplished something extraordinary. They had defended 6,600 miles of coastline with minimal resources. They had protected critical infrastructure. They had provided intelligence that shaped military operations, and they had done it all without pay, without glory, without recognition. But their service didn't end with the war. ATG veterans and their supporters launched a campaign that would have lasting impacts on Alaska and American society. They petitioned the territorial legislature to end the segregation of Alaska's indigenous peoples. During the war, these men and women had served their country, carried weapons, worn uniforms, and defended American soil. Yet in many communities, they couldn't eat in certain restaurants, attend certain schools, or access certain public facilities. The veterans insisted on equal treatment, and they had the moral authority of their service behind them. Their campaign succeeded. Alaska passed its first anti-discrimination law, becoming one of the pioneers in civil rights legislation. It was a remarkable achievement, but recognition for their military service took far longer. For decades, ATG veterans received no official acknowledgement. They had no veteran status, no access to benefits, no formal discharge papers. They existed in a bureaucratic limbo, having served their country but not being counted as veterans. In 1966, Alaska awarded medals to ATG members, a state-level recognition of their service. But federal recognition didn't come until the year 2000. Senator Ted Stevens, himself a World War II veteran who had flown with the Army Air Corps in China, sponsored legislation ordering the Secretary of Defense to issue honorable discharges to all Americans who had served in the Alaska Territorial Guard. President Bill Clinton signed the bill into law in August 2000. Finally, nearly 60 years after they had first volunteered, these defenders of Alaska achieved official veteran status. But by then, most were gone. The delay in recognition meant that many ATG veterans never received the benefits they had earned. The advanced age and geographic isolation of survivors made it difficult to locate them and inform them of their new status. Some veterans, like Sam Jackson, lived long enough to receive their recognition. Jackson, who continued serving in the Alaska National Guard after the ATG disbanded, was photographed in 2017 holding his Territorial Guard Medal with evident pride. He was 93 years old and one of the last living links to that remarkable force. The legacy of the Alaska Territorial Guard and Kastner's cutthroats extends far beyond World War II. They demonstrated principles that would reshape American military thinking. They proved that local knowledge and cultural expertise could be decisive in warfare. They showed that unconventional forces, operating with flexibility and initiative, could accomplish missions that conventional units couldn't. They validated the concept of training and equipping indigenous peoples as defenders of their own lands. These lessons influenced the formation of other specialized units. The Alaska Territorial Guard's success contributed to discussions about military integration and the value of diverse perspectives in defense planning. Their service provided evidence against racial theories that claimed certain peoples were unsuited for military duties or technical tasks, and their post-war civil rights activism demonstrated that military service could be a powerful tool for social change. Today, their story is preserved in museums, memorials, and historical records across Alaska. The University of Alaska maintains extensive archives documenting ATG history. The Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian has exhibits honoring their service. Statues and plaques in communities across Alaska commemorate the volunteers who kept watch during the dark days of World War II. In 2017, at a memorial park in Bethel, Alaska, visitors could see a statue of an Eskimo scout overlooking a wall of plaques dedicated to ATG members. Stanley Rogers, standing there, reflected on what the place represented. It wasn't just about honoring the past, he explained. It was about remembering that ordinary people, given the tools and opportunity, could accomplish extraordinary things. The story of the Alaska Territorial Guard and the indigenous defenders of Alaska reveals an uncomfortable truth about American history. These were people who had been denied full citizenship rights, whose cultures had been suppressed, whose lands had been taken, and whose children had been forced into boarding schools to civilize them. Yet when their country needed them, they answered the call. They didn't do it because America had treated them fairly. They did it because Alaska was their home, had been their home for thousands of years, and they would not let invaders take it. They served knowing they might never be recognized, never be compensated, never even be remembered. And for decades that prediction proved accurate. History books focused on the major battles in Europe and the Pacific, on the famous generals and decorated heroes. The story of a few thousand indigenous volunteers watching Alaska's coastline didn't fit the narrative of American triumph, but their contribution was real and vital. Without the Alaska Territorial Guard, Alaska's coastline would have been vulnerable. Japanese forces could have established observation posts, weather stations, or submarine bases in countless remote locations. The Lend-Lease route would have been threatened. The platinum mine at Platinum would have been at risk. The indigenous peoples of Alaska understood something that military planners were only beginning to grasp in the 1940s. Modern warfare required more than tanks and planes and ships. It required information, intelligence, local knowledge, and the ability to operate in environments where conventional forces struggled. The ATG provided all of this. Kastner's cutthroats demonstrated another crucial principle. The most effective special operations forces are often those who blend seamlessly into the local environment, who understand the terrain and culture, who can survive and operate where others cannot. The Alaska Scouts set a template that would be followed in subsequent conflicts, from the Philippine Scouts who inspired them to modern, special forces units operating in hostile environments worldwide. The technological and strategic lessons learned in Alaska during World War II continue to resonate today. As climate change opens Arctic shipping routes and multiple nations assert claims to northern territories, Alaska's strategic importance has only increased. The United States maintains significant military presence in Alaska precisely because of what the ATG and Alaska Scouts proved. Control of the North Pacific and Arctic regions could be decisive in future conflicts, and the descendants of those ATG volunteers continue to serve. Alaska has one of the highest rates of military service per capita in the United States. Many service members come from the same communities that produced ATG volunteers in 1942. They carry forward a tradition of defending their homeland that predates American statehood. When Japanese forces invaded Attu and Kiska in June 1942, they expected to face either no resistance or conventional military forces they understood. What they encountered instead was something their military doctrine hadn't prepared them for. An enemy that could appear from nowhere, observe without being seen, and disappear into terrain that regular soldiers couldn't survive in. An enemy that fought with skills honed over thousands of years of living in one of Earth's harshest environments. An enemy that was defending not just a nation, but their ancestral homeland. The Japanese never launched a major invasion of mainland Alaska. They never established air bases to threaten American cities. They never interdicted the Lend-Lease route. And while many factors contributed to this, from American naval power to logistical challenges, part of the reason was the knowledge that Alaska wasn't undefended. The Alaska Territorial Guard was there, watching, waiting, ready to resist. Over 6,000 volunteers from over 100 communities, ages 12 to 80, men and women of multiple indigenous nations, had made it clear that Alaska would not fall easily. The story deserves to be remembered, not as a footnote to World War II, but as a central chapter in the defense of North America. These were the people who held the line when the line was vulnerable. They were America's hidden defenders, the indigenous warriors who proved that courage, skill, and determination could overcome technological disadvantage and official neglect. Their service helped win a war, their activism helped expand civil rights, and their example continues to inspire. If you found this story fascinating and want to learn more about forgotten chapters of history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Ignis Tempora. We bring you these incredible stories of human courage and resilience, the ones that don't always make it into the textbooks but deserve to be remembered. Share this video with anyone who loves military history, indigenous history, or just amazing stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And let me know in the comments, had you heard about the Alaska Territorial Guard before? What other forgotten stories of World War II should we cover? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.